Welcome. I'm glad you found the way to this far away meeting room. This is about Prometheus, what's new and what's next. So I'm mostly here. Okay, now, clicker, please work. I'm mostly here because I'm that Prometheus person. I joined the project fairly early. I'm still fairly active. There's also a story. I mean, if you have been at DevOps Berlin for the last few instances of this thing, you might be a fan of the convention or myself or Prometheus. I've been here every single time, and the first DevOps Berlin ever was also the second ever conference where Prometheus was presented. That was 2015. So we kind of have a little love relationship, this conference and Prometheus. And I mean, my talks were not always directly about Prometheus, but there was always something about Prometheus. And of course, nowadays, Prometheus is kind of mainstream, so I thought that like the typical introduction talk is something that essentially everybody can do. And I thought I should just give you like the hottest news of the press from the Prometheus development. And that was the idea of this talk. We'll talk about this in a second, a bit more detail. If you have been at previous talks, you might remember that I work for SoundCloud. That's not true anymore. As of last week, I work for Grafana, which I guess you all know perhaps even better than SoundCloud, as you are DevOps people and not musicians. But still, this was not nothing bad happened. It was essentially a job move for me to focus even more on Prometheus. And Grafana is the company behind the dashboard builder you all know and hopefully love. But it is also by now committed into many open source projects in observability land, and one of them is Prometheus. The ironic thing is I submitted this talk, this conference has a long CFP, what is it? They ask you a half year in advance for your submissions, and I was totally submitting this, assuming I work for SoundCloud. But for some reason, I just did the right thing, did this Prometheus talk, and you will see this talk is haunted by Grafana. It always feels like the logical consequence that I work for them as of last week. Okay, Prometheus, by the way, even if this talk might cause a contrary impression, it's not dominated by a single company. Prometheus was developed at SoundCloud initially, but then SoundCloud was never a company that wanted to offer a monitoring solution as a service or something. SoundCloud offers music streaming. So they just needed this as a tool, created that, put it in the open source, and now it's backed by many companies. It's kind of rare that an open source project is both very successful and fairly big and backed by more than just one company. There are many companies behind it. Some more, some less, but definitely a lot. All right. Before we talk about the news, I thought we should do a really quick recap of Prometheus's history, because you have to know history to know the present and the future, right? Okay, so when was Prometheus started? When it's an open source project started, that's the first commit on GitHub, right? And that's the first commit, 2012, November, by Matt Proud, one of the founders. He's now an alumnus, but he had the first commit in Prometheus, which is the repo for the Prometheus server, but the Prometheus GitHub org has many other repos. But I think this is also the first commit in that org. So now you might be surprised, 2012, that's 7 years ago. Most people might have this date in mind when talking about the birth of Prometheus, because that was the public announcement. That was also when we went to SRECon in Dublin for the first talk, and then to DevOpsCon in Berlin for the second talk. So there was a blog post on the SoundCloud Backstage blog. There was a blog post on a few other early adopters of this monitoring system. And this is often perceived as the birth date of Prometheus. But it was always an open source project. It was just so weird because it was so different from everything else in the open source world that kind of nobody saw it, and there were very few self-selected people who found it and were contributing even before that date. All right, from then it was kind of going uphill all the time. 2016 joins Kubernetes, sorry, I cannot read my own notes. It joins Kubernetes as the second project of the CNCF. I wanted to say it joined the CNCF. CNCF is now something everybody knows, and also Kubernetes, you might have heard about it, right? I think it was mentioned once or twice at this conference. So there was a project in the CNCF, and the CNCF decided back then they don't want to have the Kubernetes foundation, they want to have other cloud native stuff. And the first project they looked at after Kubernetes, we were lucky enough to be that project. So it was Prometheus. And then not much later, we had the 1.0 release, which was it was an important milestone because that was when we committed to certain stability guarantees, semantic versioning, whatever. I mean, that means we still have some experimental areas in the server, but all the areas declared stable. We're now following semantic versioning. But it was essentially 0 dot something, 9, 10, 11, whatever, 18. I don't remember. It was just considered to be stable enough, and then we called it 1.0. So it was not like a huge change in the technology, just in our guarantees. And then a year later, there was 2.0, so semantic versioning. We increased the major release number, so there was a breaking change, or more. I mean, there were loads of breaking changes. A lot of stuff was patched up here. Most prominently, the storage layer got completely rewritten with a lot of countless advantages, but also new and more interesting failure cases. But yeah, that's how it goes. 2018 was also, last year, not so long ago, was the year where the project graduated. So CNCF has like 3 tiers. If you join nowadays you are a sandbox project. You're just playing in the sandbox or something. And once you are out of that and grown up, you become an incubating project. Prometheus started as incubating at Kubernetes as well because there was no sandbox back then. And then there are like very strict criteria to go into graduated mode, essentially. Prometheus almost made it before Kubernetes, but that's mostly because Kubernetes is a gigantic project and Prometheus is much smaller, so it's easier to get all those criteria fulfilled. There are many. For me personally, I think what's really important is that CNCF requires projects to have a governance structure. They don't require to have the CNCF governance structure, they just require you to have a governance structure. So every project can pick their own poison, but I think that's really important. We totally saw that in our project. If you have just like a few people who try to figure everything out, it's not very transparent, it looks weird to outsiders. So now there's a clearly documented way how we come to decisions, how we vote if need be, even like how you get into this inner circle of the voting body, how you get kicked out of it. Hopefully that doesn't need to happen, but yeah. That's what we have now, and then also you could say graduation means like you're done now. The project is done, like, okay, we like maintain a few things, bug fixes, but yeah, done, right? This is what I heard some people, yeah, Prometheus is done, right? Nothing will happen. Now, the CNCF also gives you this CNCF devstats site where they display along all kind of dimensions the activity, GitHub activity in the various projects. The dashboard, I told you it's haunted by Grafana. They use Grafana as the dashboard builder for that. So this is all repos in the GitHub org activity. And you see all the revolutionary things happen before 1.0, right? That's when we told the world, look, we have like label-based, time series-based monitoring and alerting. And people were like looking, wow, what is that? And then they realized how awesome this is and not rules the world. But all of those revolutionary things happen in this, like, you can't even see it, right? It's just like a tiny bit of activity. Announcement, spike of activity. I think that's mostly because people filed issues and whatever, like they count all kind of stuff as activities there. I think if you thumb up a comment or something, it's already an activity. So there was an initial spike, and then, yeah, things went along. There's a clear upwards trend. There are like dips in the like holiday period. And now the naive assumption is it's graduated, it's done, right? So graduation happened approximately here. And what actually happened is even more activity than ever before. Interestingly, you could say it's more like in other repos, not just in Prometheus, which is the big green thing here, which I think is a good thing. It means the ecosystem is evolving. You have more like integrations, exporters, whatever. But this is also only Prometheus GitHub org. The ecosystem has so much more, which is not in the GitHub org, and it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, if you just write an exporter, you want to give it to the world, you just put it in your own GitHub org. It's fine. It doesn't have to be in the Prometheus org. So the ecosystem as a whole is probably even more like up and to the right. So there's a lot happening, and that was essentially where I thought I should actually give a talk about all those good things. So this is the famous architecture diagram. And I put it here mostly to make clear that the Prometheus server is just a tiny bit of the whole thing, right? I mean, in this diagram are some things that you know from the Prometheus GitHub org, like the push gateway, the alert manager, and so on. But there are also things that have nothing to do with Prometheus, like PagerDuty, but they integrate with Prometheus. Or Grafana, I told you it's haunted. So this has even parts that are not part of the Prometheus GitHub org, but they are part of the wider ecosystem. I also put open metrics here, which is actually not in the architecture diagram. I kind of photoshopped that in. This is an attempt, we will talk about it later, to standardize the Prometheus exposition format in slightly modified form, so it's more generally applicable, but mostly to allow people to integrate against it without being afraid this is something dictated by Prometheus. So there will be like a real committee, or there is already a committee where like people from other companies and organizations are part of it. So I put this in here because that affects this part. So ecosystem is gigantic. Like there's the whole global ecosystem, there's the Prometheus GitHub org with a lot of repos, and then there's Prometheus the server. But coming to the news, I had to pick news, right? And so I really want to appreciate how big the ecosystem is, but to even start, I had to restrain myself to certain news, and I decided to restrain myself to just the Prometheus server for this talk. Which doesn't mean like I try to leave a lot of time for Q&A, so if you have any questions about awesome new features in the Alert Manager or something else you want to know, just ask me in the Q&A. Yeah, so much to cover. Still, even if I focus on the Prometheus server and define new as happened in the last 12 months, like when I say 1 year old, I don't mean the calendar year, but just the last 12 months. Even then, it's too much to cover. So I still picked, and it's totally arbitrary, of course, but I will try to explain why I picked it. And we can start with, oh no, this is a meta thing we should start with. That's actually not a new feature. It's just something to keep in mind. Almost a year ago, we decided, for better or worse, to just have a fixed release cadence. I'm personally, like idealistically, not a friend of that. I think an open source project should have a new release when it's the right time to have a new release. Something interesting happened and I want to release it, right? If there's a bug, we have bug fixes anyway, but this is about minor releases. So what we saw in practice is that if nobody feels responsible, and the larger the project is, the more frequently that happens, people just forget to release. And then, we haven't had a release in half a year, and there are so many things we need to release now, and it's risky and whatever, kind of DevOps-y style, right? So you could also just build from master all the time, which we try to keep stable, but then there are people who come along and say, yeah, we want some kind of release process and release binary. So we just said, okay, every 6 weeks we will release no matter what. The downside is, if you want to release something more quickly, it's kind of not possible, but then I guess 6 weeks is fast enough. And the other downside is if nothing interesting happens in 6 weeks, you will just release a very boring minor release. Luckily, every release so far was super interesting. 2.11 is the current one. No, sorry, 2.10 is the current one, which I released. So we have release shepherds for each one. And 2.11 is, we have found a volunteer. We have I think we have volunteers for the next 3 or 4. Or something. Oh, my microphone is disappearing somehow. Okay, we'll see. If it falls down, it will be very loud. Okay, so this is happening now every 6 weeks. We have a release, worked out quite nicely. Like other Kubernetes has this, Go has this, right? So you know the game here. Okay, now I won't talk about quite a few things. This is really okay. I think now I got it. So why won't I talk about interesting thing like backfilling data, which is related to bulk import and retroactive rule evaluation, or the many improvements of the remote read and write interface, which is a super hot thing because everybody always asks for remote storage. So why not talk about them? The reason is another Prometheus developer, Gautam, he by coincidence, had a talk at GrafanaCon recently, and it was essentially the same idea. Let's just talk about Prometheus history a bit, and then about the new things in Prometheus and the things planned. And I said, oh no, exactly the same talk. And but then I realized there are so many things you can talk about. I could totally give another talk and talk about completely different things. So I intentionally unpicked all the things in this talk. If you missed them, there's the YouTube link, and here are the slides. You can just watch this talk. It's a really nice talk, and learn about all the new features in that talk. Also, GrafanaCon. Grafana's haunting us. Gautam is working for Grafana. He's my colleague. We were actually working in my living room for the last week because he's visiting Berlin right now. Yeah. So there we are. I talk about all the other things, which are also plenty. So now let's finally start. So I picked this one because it's the oldest bug that got fixed in the last year. Bug number 422. I think we are at 5,000 something now. That was filed in 2014, even prior the public announcement. So what's this about? Persist alert for state across restart. So if you have ever written a Prometheus alert, you might have used this for clause, which tells you if this alert fires, don't page me right now. Only fire me if it has continuously fired for 2 minutes, right? That's the for clause. It helps you to keep things less noisy. And for some alerts, it makes a lot of sense. For some others, not. Some people say, like, you should always have 4 or 5 minutes just in case, but it delays alerts, whatever. But there are very specific use cases where people want something like for 3 days or for 1 week. It's rare because usually alerts are about something has like is broken. I want to get alerted immediately. But some people have something like, if this hasn't worked for a whole week, and there's an alert like X hasn't worked, but you say, okay, this is fine, but if this is ongoing for a week, I want to get the alert. So you write down for 1 week, 1W, that's possible, and good. So now this might be that, I don't know what kind of DevOps flavor you are following, but perhaps in your company, every server is restarted at least once per week because, I don't know, to test if it comes up properly, or you rebuild your whole infrastructure every week and you restart everything. Like this is a real thing, right? Rebuild your infrastructure from scratch every Monday, everything gets restarted. So and then you will find that your alert never fires. And that was luckily already acknowledged in 2014. The problem is if the Prometheus server is restarted, it will count all those 4 times from 0. So if you restart your server every week and have an alert that only really notifies you after a week, it will never notify you. So what we need is we need to persist this state. And that's not as easy as it looks. Like we have tags, if you want to contribute to Prometheus, we have tags good first issue or low hanging fruit. These are good issues to tackle as like a first thing. But if you see not as easy as it looks, it's probably not as easy as it looks. So this was tackled in, when was it closed? I mean, last year, right? It's further down. So it was tackled by a person named Ganesh. This was his Google Summer of Code project. So Google Summer of Code is awesome. It's like win-win-win. It's good for the students. It's good for the open source projects. It's good for the mentors because they learn mentoring. And it's good for the world because they get awesome new features. It's just great, right? It's a boom. Also, like this person made a career. He's now in Prometheus team in that voting body. Also works for Grafana. Okay, but yeah, I didn't know that. Like this whole talk was set up before I even knew that. Anyway, So this was done. It's now persisting this stuff. It's all good. You can just restart your server. As long as you keep the disk storage around, you will just continue to count these times. Great. Okay. So next thing is 2 issues that were fixed last year, and they are all about this seemingly simple requirement, like an ops person. This is perfect requirement, right? My Prometheus server should never run out of disk space, and it should never right? Sure, this is what we want. Let's talk about disk space first, because that's easy. This is also fairly old, number 968. So it's also old, but it's also quite important. So this was filed where people said, okay, I want my Prometheus server to fill the disk and use all of it, but not more, obviously, right? So what the traditional idea was in Prometheus land, you tell Prometheus how many days of metrics it should keep. By default, 15 days, because Prometheus is more meant to be like alert-centric. You don't need like years. You could set it to years, but then there are also long-term storage solutions, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, you set it by default to 15 days, but it might just be too much data for your disk, and then your disk will just run full, and horrible things will happen. So why not just set something, okay, fill the disk to 80% and then start to delete metrics, the oldest metrics. Guess what? This is not as easy as it looks. So the technical reason why this was not as easy was Prometheus 1 storage model. It was designed with many things in mind, just not how to delete data. We kind of thought we will think about that later, and it turned out that, like, I think it was, I don't know, 50% of the disk capacity in Prometheus 1 was just used to find out what data to delete and how to delete it. And deletion is actually hard. This has been served perfectly in Prometheus 2. It's really easy to delete like certain old blocks of data. So that made it much simpler, but it was still problematic. So this is the pull request added storage size-based retention method and new metrics. Okay. It's done by Krasi, who is working for Red Hat, not Grafana. But I mean, I think there are many people involved in that because it required like changing of the storage and everything. You see, there were many people commenting on this PR. It had 273 comments on this seemingly simple change. So, I mean, for one, people were actually discussing if that's a good thing. And that's, I mean, it's really typical for the Prometheus community. Sometimes people are a bit upset about it, that everything is discussed very carefully, to say the least. So this is, people just said, okay, if I use this new setting and Prometheus magically starts to delete data, but on the other hand, I'm really keen on having 2 weeks of data. And now, like, let's say my Prometheus server ingests more metrics and deletes stuff earlier than usual. And one day I want to look at, like 2 weeks ago, I want to look at like metrics from an outage to write the postmortem, which you should do way more quickly, of course. But and then it's gone, right? Suddenly you only have 10 days of metrics because your disk was almost full. And that's kind of surprising. And so people argued you should actually have a fixed retention time, and then you should have alerting because you're anyway using Prometheus. You should alert on the disk running full. Now, counter argument is, of course, you can also alert on Prometheus deleting data at a certain time. You can alert on anything. So in the end, it was concluded we want this feature, but it should be optional. And after a lot of comments with the right metrics, it's now finally there. The old flag was storage TSV retention, which just had a duration here. Now, of course, we need storage TSV retention .size. So it's kind of inconsistent, so we introduced a new flag, .time and .size, and you can even use both, and it will delete whatever applies earlier, right? So you can say, keep at most 15 days of metric and be at most that large on the disk. So the old flag is still around because we didn't want to increment the major release counter just for this. So old configurations still work. There are a few caveats. This is the maximum number of bytes that can be stored for blocks. So this is like a TSV internal thing. The bulk data is stored in so-called blocks, but then there's a write-ahead log that could be fairly large. And of course, there's other stuff like logs that Prometheus creates and other things on that machine that are not Prometheus related. So it's not like just don't fill the disk. You really have to say, okay, I use at most that many gigabytes for blocks, and then I have to do some whatever rule of thumb for the rest on the server. But usually it should work quite nicely. Like ever since we had this at SoundCloud, at least, we never had a Prometheus server just filling the disk. All right, so that works now, but that was the easy part, that was disk. Memory is really hard, right? Whoever has dived into memory will realize how weird this is. There's like virtual memory and RSS and whatever, and it's all different on different Linux versions, and it's different on different Unix versions. And right now we are trying to get memory stats for Windows into Prometheus, and then Windows calls it all differently, and nobody knows which is. Well, memory is just magic, right? Also, there was this very interesting flag in Prometheus 1.0, which was storage local target heap size. So you could tell Prometheus in 1.0 what heap size it should try to keep, which made people think Prometheus, you could just tell Prometheus, just use at most 1 gigabyte, and then it would do everything you want, like all your metrics, all your queries, and queuing, cancer, and everything in 1 gigabyte. That was never true, of course, but people kind of thought that, and in Prometheus 2, there is no such flag anymore. Prometheus 2 has way fewer flags. That was part of the design goal, to make it operationally simple. And people say, okay, but how do I restrict Prometheus 2 to only use X gigabyte of memory? And our answer is Prometheus 2 just takes what it needs. The reason is that Prometheus 1, for good reasons back then, but crazy enough, it had its own memory management. So you essentially needed this flag so that Prometheus knew how much heap it could use to cache metrics data that is already written to disk. While Prometheus 2 just maps metrics data on disk, and then the operating system is doing exactly the right thing. So Prometheus 2, you will just see that it takes more and more memory, depending on the operating system, if the memory map data is part of the memory you see as consumed by your process, but the kernel can just take it away. Also, Go 1.12 changed it all. The RSS now looks way bigger, but the kernel can take it back, whatever. Like, it's complicated, as I said, right? Also, Prometheus 1 had a few things where it tried to restrict memory usage by throttling ingestion and stuff like that, but that was actually more counterproductive than it helped. So Prometheus 2 actually really takes what it needs. But of course, it also takes, in general, less than Prometheus 1, with exceptions. So in general, you just have to give Prometheus enough memory to do what you want it to do. That's the simple answer. But there's still an easy way to a Prometheus server, but just enter a very abusive query. And there are even some queries where Prometheus 2 is more memory hungry than Prometheus 1. So that might have been a reason why people asked for this flag. They migrated to Prometheus 2, ran the expensive query, and it oomed. And I mean, it's bad that just a random user can type in an abusive query and you oom your Prometheus server. There's a silver lining, and that's why we have new features here. First of all, there was in 2.3, Brian optimized PromQL. So he essentially went through the whole PromQL engine and tried to save memory wherever he could. And that, especially those queries that are very memory hungry became much less memory hungry. So now it's way harder to even create an abusive query that would oom your Prometheus server. Again, this was 68 commits, 134 comments. Like, this was really invasive, but it was kind of worth it from that perspective. But of course, you can just try harder and create an even more abusive query, and still your Prometheus server would oom. But even for that, we have stuff. The optimized PromQL PR also put some plumbing into place. That's somebody else, Callum, who now works for Grafana, used to implement these two. No, actually, this is the new flag, max samples. So we still, because it's so hard to just say, just use X gigabyte or never oom, this is really hard to implement, especially in Go. But what we can do, we can say a query can only have that many samples materialized in memory. Like the Prometheus storage has like weird ways of saving metrics data in a nicely compressed fashion. But if you actually touch the numbers, at some point you must have a 64-bit float in memory, right? And of those, a single query by default can only have 5 million. So this is the main driver of memory consumptions caused by queries. So the one caveat here is if you upgrade your Prometheus server to 2.5, I mean, that's a couple of months ago, but perhaps you have already run into it, and suddenly some of your queries don't work anymore. And they used to work before. That's because you had enough memory, but we put this as a safety default. So if you have enough memory, you can just increase that. There's also an older flag, max concurrency, which is by default 20. That's the number of queries that are processed concurrently. So by multiplying both of them, you get an idea how much memory your Prometheus server will at most take for queries. So you can play with that. It's unfortunately not as easy as just multiplying it, and this results in some RAM amount, but you can kind of look at your operating system, your specific version, and get some numbers to at least cap it. It's not ideal, but you kind of have a good lever now to make sure that not a random user is ooming your Prometheus server by intentionally or accidentally entering a query. Whoever uses remote read might have a similar issue if you actually use the remote read integration, and there are similar flags. Now, sadly, they are slightly differently worded, but they are very similar. So you can do the same thing for remote queries so that they won't oom your server either. And that was done by Tom, who is also a Prometheus developer and works for Grafana. But anyway. Okay, so we have some ways of not ooming and not filling your disk. So next thing, 2.7, it's not that old, but it's still fairly old. But I picked this one because this is, I think it's the most frequently asked question, I would think. It's called Subquery support for range selection, which probably most of you won't know what that is. But for me, it was like I had this number in my head, because if somebody asked a question, and the question was this one, somebody entered a legitimate query and got this gibberish result. And then I could just say, it's issue number 1227. So what is that? We should look at it. I just picked a metric from the Prometheus server itself, but you can have this with any counter. Like you take any counter and you calculate a rate over 5 minutes to get whatever, QPS. In this case, it's how many samples per second is my Prometheus server ingesting, calculated as an average over 5 minutes. That's the PromQL expression. That's what you probably do all the time. And now it's totally legitimate to ask the question, okay, what's the peak rate over the last hour? And I look into the PromQL manual and I see there's a function for it, max over time, over 1 hour, right? I type this in and I get this gibberish error message. Query parse error char 71 range spec must be preceded by a metric selector, but follows a pointer PromQL call, whatever. Like, if you know PromQL and how it all works, it's of course not gibberish. It's the truth because it's coming out of your computer. But for normal users, what? And then they ask on the mailing list or IRC channel, and that Prometheus person just tells, yeah, it's number 1227. Okay, so what's the reason why this is going wrong here? The reason is that this max over time has to look at something that is itself a Prometheus query. And that's called a subquery. And that was not supported. It's also a bit risky, could easily explode like resource-wise. And I'm sure there was not as easy as it looks, right? Okay, so this was finally solved if you where's the version 2.7, right? If you have Prometheus 2.7 or later, and you type in exactly that query, you get exactly the same error message. But if you add a little colon here, and there's a reason why this has to be colon, then it will just work. This is your peak rate over the last 1 hour. Yay. So colon, why colon? That's all explained in this blog post on the Prometheus blog on prometheus.io, written by Ganesh. We have already met him. He's our former GSOC student, and he also implemented subquery support and wrote this blog post. So this explains why you need this colon. It's a bit more complicated. It's talk of its own. But most cases, if you want this legitimate query, you just add this colon and it does what you want. Okay. So these were my picks for the news from the last year. Now what's next? The best thing is to look at the roadmap. There's a roadmap on the Prometheus.io webpage. In my opinion, a roadmap should be like visionary and give you like a roadmap for the next years. Interestingly, our roadmap is very tangible. It's all things that are very imminent or almost imminent or already done even, whatever. So server-side metric metadata support, that's a bigger thing. You might have wondered when you instrument code with Prometheus metrics, you give a help string, like you really, whatever. You invest some effort in writing a nice help string. You tell it if it's a gauge or counter, and then on the Prometheus server, you never see the help string, and you never see if it's a gauge or a counter. You just have to know, and there's this convention that counters end on _total. But I mean, why have you entered all this information? This is like because the exposition format was created with all the vision in mind, and the vision was that we will have this metadata and that the Prometheus server will tell you that you can never rate a gauge and only counters and all those things. And it kind of never happened. And there was a so-called first step to use the metadata. So historically, the Prometheus server was just throwing away all the metadata. And now it's not doing that anymore. So this is actually already implemented, this first step. We have here, querying target metadata. So I mean, first of all, you can always look at the metrics endpoint to just understand as a human, what is this metric about. But even in the Prometheus server, it saves the metadata, and there is an API v1 targets metadata HTTP API endpoint, which gives you the metadata. So you can already query this, and Prometheus will tell you, from this target, I scraped a metric, and it was a gauge, and had the following help string. Sadly, nobody's making use of this so far, including the Prometheus server itself. Like you want a tooltip with like you draw a graph and then you want a tooltip that tells you this is the gauge with the following help string or something, right? So there's still work to be done, but the little metadata API already exists. But I think there's a lot of more complicated things to do, and they should be on the roadmap, but they aren't yet. But anyway, it's happening. Okay, next step, adopt open metrics. I already mentioned open metrics. That's this effort to make the Prometheus exposition format a standard that is not nominally and practically owned just by Prometheus people. So there are people like, I think, Uber and Google and several others in a group, and they're working on it. It's coming soon. This has been there for a while. This is openmetrics.io, the webpage. It should have text representation and protocol buffers. And I mean, I'm maintaining the Go client for Prometheus exposition, and I'm really waiting for something tangible to get out of this. The Python client already has experimental support. Prometheus server has experimental support to ingest, what will probably be in there, but it will be very close to what we have now in Prometheus. And this is kind of, you can already integrate against the Prometheus exposition format, and many are doing this, but with this, you can even tell your boss, listen, it's not even a Prometheus thing, it's like a real standard with whatever, IEEE, whatever, like all those groups, IETF, right? That's the group that wants to do that. Okay, it's hopefully happening very soon. Now, backfill time series, that's already mentioned in Gautham's talk. This is semi-done, because the plumbing is there. I think I have a slide. Yeah, this is in Gautham's talk as already done, but it's not quite there. There is, sorry, I have to tell you that without a slide. Prometheus is really good in scraping 1 million targets or 1 million metrics and update them all, which is the hard problem. Like it's a database design problem, right? To update 1 million different data points very quickly. The seemingly simple thing is just have one time series over a year and put it into your storage. But the Prometheus time series database is not optimized for that. And also, like Prometheus 1 was kind of good at it in principle, but it was never leveraged. And Prometheus 2 is really hard. And the plumbing for that is now implemented. Like you can put in a very low level way this data into the storage, and then the storage will kind of aggregate it into those data blocks and everything. But there is no real tooling around it. So there's no easy way to say, here's the time series I have from another source, please put it into your storage. This will happen soon. People are working on the tooling now that the plumbing is in place. And this will also allow a retroactive rule evaluation, which is, if you have ever created a recording rule, you will have noticed it starts recording the moment you put it into effect, but it never is retroactively evaluated for the past, which you often want. And also things like that will happen. Okay, and final thing, this is really funny. TLS and authentication in HTTP serving endpoints. Seems like something everybody should have. Prometheus has this Unix approach, do one thing and do it well, and we always said TLS serving is not the one thing that we do or do well. I mean, you could always use Prometheus to scrape HTTPS endpoints, but Prometheus is technically the client. The Prometheus monitoring server is technically the client when scraping things, right? It's HTTPS client. That's kind of the easy part. That's what our browsers do all the time. But setting up a server with those gazillions of configuration methods to set up TLS endpoints is really hard. And we just said it's not our problem. Just use like Nginx or HAProxy or some inverse proxy to do this. And you have a sidecar pattern in Kubernetes is super easy. So people use a reverse proxy sidecar to scrape the exporter, which is a sidecar of what it's actually monitoring, which by itself might be a sidecar. Like we had a real example like that at SoundCloud. Like we had a memcached proxy sidecar that got an 2M proxy, right? And then there's a 2M proxy exporter to monitor it, and to have this with TLS, you need a sidecar for like the sidecar for the sidecar for the sidecar, and it gets crazy at some point for something that everybody should use anyway. So finally, Prometheus community decided, let's try out how to do TLS serving in a proper way, and there is a pull request for the node exporter, which is our canary here. Node exporter should natively be scrapable via TLS. And you see this is already the cleaner version. That's the second attempt. It already has 75 conversation. You can see the scroll bar here. Like, phew, this is the conversation. Nobody has approved it yet. So it's, again, not as easy as it looks. But it's coming. And once we have figured this out, we can do the same thing for all the like serving endpoints, HTTP endpoints. And finally have TLS. Okay. Also, Google Summer of Code. I mentioned that. This is a great thing. It's everywhere. And we have new GSOC students. I think we have 3 GSOC projects that are directly Prometheus related, and one that is Cortex, which is one of those remote storage integrations. I just picked this one because it is, the PromBench thing is more for developers, but there's the formatting thing. So long-standing issue of Prometheus rule formatting. PromQL expressions can be super complicated, and then you nicely format them so you can at least read them. But on your Prometheus server, in the web status page, it's all on one line then, and Prometheus shows it how the machine would see it, right? And we want the formatting, first of all, to display it properly on the Prometheus status page, but also like GoFimt, right? So you can write a PromQL query and hit a button on your editor, and it will nicely format the PromQL rule in a canonical way. So that's happening here. All right, so I think we have despite our late start, we have a few minutes. So now you can ask me anything. So if you want to know more details about any of the news, you can ask me. If you want to hear about new features you have heard about but you missed it here, you can ask me, or you can even ask me to implement new features or things that you're missing in Prometheus in general. I mean, there are good channels like the mailing list or IRC, but also conferences, or really anything. Okay, for now, thank you. And I'll open the Q&A. Thanks. Yeah, I guess 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, yeah, please. Okay, question is, what remote storage type is Cortex supporting? I think I've even, of course, this conference was already full of discussing remote storage solutions. Wait a sec, is that working? Okay, so, I mean, there are, Prometheus has a read and a write API for remote storage. The write one is where Prometheus essentially just writes out all the metrics it collects to some endpoint. That has to be implemented in a certain way. And then there's the read interface, which means you can hack in a PromQL query in Prometheus, and if the data is not locally available, it will ask the remote storage. And there are a gazillion of databases that integrate against those endpoints, and Cortex has read and write. So it goes both directions. Now, I don't know if that was what you're fishing for when you said which type it supports. Okay, so you want to know where it is storing its data. Okay, I mean, I'm not a Cortex expert, although the main developer is working for Grafana now, but it was developed at ReefWorks by that same person. You just have to check out. I think it's, I'm not sure. I would be lying. You have to check out. So this is the thing. If you want to run Cortex on your own, you have to store the bulk data of Cortex somewhere. And I think it was initially Amazon, but it's now also Grafana offers this as a product, but I shouldn't pitch products here. It's just Cortex is also doing like this tenant-based thing that you have multiple customers. You can separate that. Everybody has their separate view. In general, if you are like using Prometheus and trying to find a really lightweight and very Promethean way to use long-term storage, I would look at Thanos. That's like the most Promethean way. The read path is not implemented here because it just treats that completely different. It's a very different approach in general, but this is, I think, where it saves it in S3 buckets, the long-term stuff, and I'm sure they're working on other integrations as well. All right, more or less. I mean, you have to check it out in detail. Okay, other questions? Anybody? Don't be shy. You can even ask in German if you like. Was there somebody? No. Should I just like talk about other stuff then, like alert manager stuff? How many minutes do we have? Can even try to demo something. Okay, last chance. There's one. So working hours, the question is it possible to like do something according to working hours? You probably want something, this alert should only fire during work hours. Yeah, so this is also a very good question where it totally touches this area of, is this one of the things we want to do well? My personal nightmare here is that some countries in this world have this weird concept that they turn the clock 1 hour like ahead and back twice a year for some weird reason. I hope you don't live in one of those countries or not for much longer. So the problem is you essentially need a full time zone spec in whatever decides if it's working hours, because you have to know all the rules when daylight saving time kicks in or not. And he just said, we don't want to touch that, right? And ideally something like, Prometheus or the Prometheus Alert Manager, they are not sending you directly the alerts. They are always using some notification mechanism, PagerDuty, Slack, email, whatever. And we usually say it's not the one thing we're in charge of. The like PagerDuty should take care of that. Of course, it's a bit lame. There are hacks, like you have a time of day, hour of the day and day of month. Like you have functions like that in PromQL, and then you can hack together something that will calculate, is it Saturday or Sunday, or is it before 6 or after 7 in my time zone? It just doesn't know about daylight saving time. The answer is you can hack it together, and there are a bunch of people who did this and shared this on the internet, but there's no like easy click a button, please only fire during work hours. And I think it's also not planned because it's really like opening a can of worms, essentially, if you do this. Ideally, you have it somewhere in whatever your equivalent of PagerDuty is, or you do this hacky things. But yeah, it's a bit sad. When daylight saving time is history, we can talk about it again. Okay, another question, perhaps? There's one. Yeah, I mean, the list is here, right? I don't want to pick winners here. Everyone has its own little characteristics. Yeah, as I said, like if first of all, you should think. Yeah, and how are you? Personally, I have very limited operational experience. My current employer now runs Cortex as a service, so they do that really well. But I'm also not sure if you want to run Cortex like just on premise, depending how big you are. If you have like tenants, Thanos is the one that intuitively I like most because it's also was. Sorry, can you say that again? Yeah, with Thanos. Is it working for you? You can tell us your experience. Are you happy? It works, yeah. I mean, I think Thanos, it was written mostly by one of the Prometheus core developers. So it's very much with Prometheus in mind. While many of the others essentially said, okay, of course you also want to support Prometheus, but they are very different systems. But of course, it's really nice if you're anyway really using InfluxDB for other things that you can also get all your Prometheus metrics into InfluxDB, then it totally makes sense for you to do that. If you're like, you have nothing like that at the moment, you just want to try something out. I mean, I don't really want to pick winners, but I would probably say like just trying out Thanos is super low overhead to at least like, test it out a bit and see if it works. Other things, Thanos also, many of these solutions you can query in their own language. Like on InfluxDB, obviously you have their own query language you can then use to query, but they are also working on a transpiler now. The Influx days is right now, so you cannot be there because you're here, but there will be a talk about the PromQL transpiler where you can essentially transpile PromQL into Flux, which is the new InfluxDB query language. So there are a lot of things. It's difficult to like give you a rule of thumb what to pick. All right, now I think we don't have enough time so that I can actually demo something with the alert stuff, but we have a few more minutes so you can ask something more. Anything? There's one. So the question is, are there plans to make rules configurable via like an API push or something, right? Very good question, as in this is again a very philosophical thing where the Prometheus core people usually say you should have it as code, right? I mean on the other hand, you can give the option like Grafana dashboards. You can just like go to the dashboard interactively do something, or you have like some HTTP API to push something, but then you can also dump it out as JSON again or something to save it as code. Now the Prometheus people usually tend to do like you should check everything into your source control and then your server should take it from there. That's kind of their idea, and probably the excuse would be if you really want this, you should write a little tool that receives the HTTP API call and writes out a file, and then Prometheus can reload it. I guess, yeah, I mean, I can totally understand if people are unhappy with that, but on the other hand, it also keeps like the whatever Prometheus project is feeling in charge of somewhat limited. So I would assume this is highly unlikely that it would ever happen based on like philosophy. But it's like you can have, probably somebody has done this already. Just check out the internet if somebody has written a little tool that receives HTTP calls and dumps out Prometheus files. And like Prometheus, you just send in a SIG hop and it reloads the file. So it's all like you don't have to restart the Prometheus server to get new rules in. Okay, one more. We have 1 minute. So you can ask one more question. Anybody? Famous last questions. If not, you can also pick stickers on your way out. I have very few of the not so popular round ones and have the very popular flame-shaped stickers, flame-shaped whatever stickers. So if you like, you can take one on your way out. Okay, thank you very much.